Friday night at 9:12 p.m. A pack of bikers filled the back of a small roadside diner. Lina, the quiet waitress with the blue name tag, carried plates and kept her head down. A hand grabbed her apron. Another hand tugged. Her shirt tore across the front under the bright lights. The room went still. Phones came up. Lina pulled her uniform together, set the check on the table, and walked out the front door without a scene. A black sedan eased from the curb. She got in, pressed her palm over the rip, and left the noise behind. The bikers laughed, not knowing the trouble they'd just started. Inside the car, Lina stayed silent. The city lights blurred past her window as the driver glanced at her torn uniform but said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the fabric across her chest. The driver's earpiece clicked, signaling someone waiting for news. He gave a short nod and kept driving. The air inside the sedan was calm, almost too calm, and it made her shame settle deeper. She closed her eyes, trying to hold her composure, unaware that her silence was about to speak louder than any words ever could. The sedan pulled into a long driveway guarded by tall gates. Two men in suits opened them without hesitation, heads lowered as the car passed through. The mansion that came into view wasn't loud or flashy, just solid and commanding. Its lights glowed faintly through heavy curtains. As the car stopped, the driver stepped out first and opened Lina's door. She didn't look at him as she got out. Her steps were slow, her shoes clicking softly against the marble entryway. Inside, someone was already waiting, watching from the top of the stairs. Marco DeLuca, her husband, leaned against the banister with one hand in his pocket. His expression was unreadable, the kind that didn't need words to make a point. He looked at Lina's torn uniform once, then at her face. She avoided his eyes and walked past him without a word, her dignity intact despite everything. Upstairs, the sound of a door closing echoed faintly. Marco remained still, his jaw tightening. Behind him, two men waited quietly in the shadows, unsure if they should leave or stay. They knew this silence meant trouble was brewing. In her room, Lina sat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts spinning between humiliation and exhaustion. She folded her shirt neatly on her lap, though the tear ran straight through the center. Her reflection in the mirror showed no tears, only the look of someone holding herself together by sheer will. From the window she saw the sedan parked below, headlights still glowing faintly. Somewhere inside her, shame turned into something else, something steadier. She knew Marco would act, and part of her feared what that might mean for everyone involved. Downstairs, Marco entered his study and poured himself a glass of water. He didn't drink it. He stood by the window watching the reflection of his own face over the city skyline. His phone vibrated once on the desk, and he read a message that confirmed what he already knew. The incident had been caught on camera. He didn't reply. Instead, he placed the phone down gently, then sat, elbows on the desk, hands pressed together. The calm in his movements made his men uneasy. They understood he wasn't planning revenge in anger, but in precision. At the diner, the bikers were still laughing. They ordered more beer, replaying what happened like it was a victory. One of them pulled up the video on his phone, showing it to a few others. The image of Lina walking away without a word drew mockery, but beneath the noise, a few of them looked uneasy. The air in the diner felt different, though none could explain why. The laughter kept echoing through the small space, bouncing off the walls like they owned the place. They had no idea who they had humiliated. Lina stood under the warm light of her bathroom mirror, washing her face. She wasn't crying, just quiet. Her hand brushed over the faint red mark on her shoulder, where the fabric had torn. The silence of the room was comforting, steady. She looked at her reflection, then reached for her wedding ring on the counter. Sliding it back on, she took a deep breath. It wasn't anger she felt, it was something colder. She wanted this night behind her, but life had already decided the story wasn't finished yet. Marco received another message, this time with a link. The video had gone viral overnight, labeled simply as Waitress versus Bikers. It had already gathered thousands of comments. He clicked play and watched Lina being mocked by strangers online. Each comment fueled something heavy inside him. His assistant entered the room quietly, setting a folder on the desk. Marco didn't speak. He just nodded, and the assistant left without question. Whatever Marco planned next wouldn't be discussed. It would happen quietly, like most of his work did when something needed to be corrected. Lina came downstairs wearing a plain shirt and jeans. Marco turned to look at her, waiting for her to speak first. She told him she didn't want chaos, just peace. She wanted to forget what happened, not make it worse. Marco nodded, pretending to agree, but the thought of his wife being humiliated burned deeper than he could contain. As she turned away, he whispered something to one of his men in passing. Orders were already forming, small ones that would soon grow into something larger. Marco didn't need to announce revenge, he only needed to begin it. Marco sat on the balcony, lighting a cigar he never smoked. He stared into the dark, letting the city lights flicker across the glass railing. Every sound in the distance reminded him of how easily people could disrespect what they didn't understand. His phone buzzed again. This time, a message showed the bikers' faces captured from the diner's security footage. Names, locations, records, all of it neatly gathered. He closed the message, exhaled slowly, and watched the smoke drift upward. The choice in front of him wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about restoring order. Back at the diner, the owner scrolled through the same viral video, horrified. He called Lina several times, his voice cracking with guilt, but she didn't answer. He knew she didn't blame him, yet the fear of losing his business hung heavy. He looked out the front window, wondering why two men in suits had parked across the street. They weren't eating, just sitting in a black car watching the place. The owner didn't know it, but that quiet presence outside was Marco's way of making sure no one else dared to cross a line again. Lana stayed in bed that morning, the world outside already spinning with gossip. Her co-workers texted to ask if she was okay, some sending screenshots of the video's spread. She thanked them but avoided the details. Instead, she opened her window to let in light. The air smelled clean, and for the first time in hours she felt calm. She didn't want pity or sympathy. She wanted control over her own story again. Downstairs, Marco was already dressed, his phone full of calls he hadn't returned. His silence spoke more than any statement ever could. Marco's younger brother Angelo arrived unannounced, carrying a file and concern on his face. He urged Marco to let things go, reminding him that public attention could draw unwanted eyes. Marco said nothing, flipping through the file instead. It contained addresses, background checks, and a list of names, all connected to the gang from the diner. Angelo realized his brother had already gone too far to stop. He sighed, left the folder, and walked out quietly. Marco stayed at his desk long after the door closed, the decision already sealed in his mind. That evening, Lina received flowers at the gate. No note, no signature, just white lilies wrapped in paper. The guard told her they came from a friend of Mr. DeLuca. She placed them on the kitchen counter, uncertain whether they were a gesture of comfort or a quiet warning from Marco's circle. As she arranged the stems in a vase, she realized the house had grown colder in the past 24 hours. Marco was distant, distracted, caught in thoughts he refused to share. The silence between them stretched like an invisible wall neither wanted to break. Late that night, Marco sat alone in his study again, staring at the torn shirt folded neatly beside a stack of papers. The phone on his desk lit up with a message. "We found them." He didn't reply. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a long moment. The quiet hum of the city filled the room. His wife was upstairs asleep, finally at peace. But Marco's mind was wide awake. To him, respect wasn't something to ask for. It was something to take back. The first move would come by morning. Marco's men gathered in the dimly lit study, waiting for instructions. The atmosphere was tense, but no one dared to speak first. Marco stood near the fireplace, staring at the faint reflection of the city on the glass. He didn't raise his voice or show anger, but the weight of his silence made everyone uneasy. He asked for the names of the men in the video. A single nod from his right-hand man confirmed that the information was already being collected. Marco turned back toward the fire. The warmth didn't reach his eyes. One of the younger men placed a tablet on the desk. The video was playing again, already circulating across several social media accounts. Marco watched for exactly 10 seconds, long enough to see his wife's face and the sound of laughter in the background. He stopped the playback, set the tablet aside, and folded his hands. He asked for the name of the gang. The reply came quietly: Steel Serpents, local bikers with a history of small crimes. Marco nodded once. He didn't need to shout. His calm made his men understand something serious had begun. Marco instructed them not to act yet. He wanted every detail before any move was made. One man offered to confront the gang immediately, but Marco refused. He didn't believe in messy retaliation. His kind of justice came in silence, through structure, not chaos. As his men dispersed, Marco stayed alone with his thoughts. He looked at a framed photo on his desk, showing Lina smiling on their wedding day. It reminded him that power without control was weakness. He had both, and tonight, he would use them carefully. Nothing about this would be random. Meanwhile, the news began to pick up the viral video. Comment sections filled with jokes and speculation, none realizing who the woman in the video was. A local talk show replayed it, calling it another diner incident, treating it like entertainment. The bikers felt proud of their new fame. They had no idea how dangerous that attention had just become. One of them, Vince, bragged online, calling Lina names. Every post, every comment, and every tag was being documented by Marco's people, quietly building a timeline of evidence without ever revealing who was collecting it. Lina sat in her bedroom, scrolling through her phone with an unreadable face. She saw the video, saw her name trending, and saw strangers debating what happened. None of them knew the truth. She turned off the phone and rested her hand over her chest. The torn shirt was folded neatly in a drawer beside her. She wanted peace, not revenge, but she also knew her husband too well. He would not let this pass. She whispered a short prayer, hoping his response wouldn't destroy more lives than it repaired. Somewhere downstairs, his phone buzzed again. Before we continue and see how this story unfolds, take a second to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It helps more than you think. Marco reviewed a report that had arrived early that morning. It listed every member of the Steel Serpents, their records, and their home addresses. He recognized several names connected to past problems. He highlighted a few lines, thinking carefully. These weren't just reckless men. They were part of a network that touched places he already controlled. He decided not to strike directly. Instead, he would remove the ground beneath their feet. No warnings, no confrontation, just quiet dismantling until they couldn't stand anymore. He didn't want blood. He wanted complete invisible collapse. By noon, Marco's lawyer had already begun subtle legal maneuvers. Old debts surfaced. Hidden fines reappeared. A few businesses that supported the Steel Serpents suddenly faced inspections. Marco knew which strings to pull without leaving fingerprints. Meanwhile, one of his men, Carlo, was assigned to watch the diner. He was told not to interfere, only to observe. Marco wanted to see if any of the bikers would return. They did that evening, laughing and ordering the same meals, acting like nothing had happened. Marco smiled faintly when Carlo called to confirm it. Predictable behavior made them easy targets. Lina received a call from her boss, who was still shaken. He offered her extended leave and apologized repeatedly, though she kept insisting it wasn't necessary. She knew the restaurant's reputation was already suffering. News reporters had called asking for interviews, but she refused them all. She didn't want to be a headline or a symbol. She wanted normal life back. Yet, deep down, she sensed something moving in the background. Marco wasn't the kind of man who left a wound untreated. His silence was never peace. It was preparation. She wished it were otherwise. Marco drove alone that evening. No bodyguards, no driver. He went to the old church his father helped build decades ago. Inside, dust hung in the air, and candles flickered near the altar. He sat in the last pew, clasping his hands together. He remembered the rule his father taught him long ago. Never start a fight you don't intend to finish. He thought about Lina's calmness, her refusal to seek revenge, and how different they were in that way. By the time he left the church, his decision was made. The bikers' downfall would start tonight. Carlo followed the gang to a local bar on the outskirts of town. From his car, he watched them brag and laugh, unaware of the quiet storm coming their way. He took photos, captured license plates, and noted who they met. A delivery van arrived later that night, loaded with stolen merchandise. Carlo relayed everything back to Marco, who only asked one question: who owned the bar? When Carlo named the owner, Marco smiled. The man owed him favors. That meant leverage, and leverage was the tool Marco preferred more than violence. The next day, Marco called an old contact, who handled logistics for several businesses, including the bar. Within hours, all shipments to that location were delayed indefinitely due to supply issues. The bar's owner called Marco personally, desperate for help. Marco offered advice instead of solutions. He suggested cutting ties with certain customers, naming the Steel Serpents directly. The owner agreed, promising to ban them for good. It was all Marco needed to hear. No threats, no warnings, just business decisions. The gang's main hangout was gone overnight, replaced with silence and locked doors. Vince, the gang leader, grew frustrated when the bar refused them service. He stormed out, shouting at the staff before realizing no one cared. For the first time, he noticed the empty tables and wary looks. They left in silence, feeling the shift but not understanding it. Back in their hideout, tempers flared. Vince blamed others for the bad luck. He had no idea that phone calls, contracts, and leases were already being rewritten behind his back. His arrogance blinded him to the truth that the empire crushing him didn't need fists, it needed signatures. Marco's next move involved real estate. Through a shell company, he quietly purchased the building where the gang rented a storage unit. Within days, notices were sent demanding payment of overdue rent that didn't actually exist. The gang, already low on cash, ignored the letters until the locks were changed. When they broke in, police were conveniently waiting, tipped off about a burglary in progress. No charges stuck, but the humiliation spread quickly. Marco didn't want them jailed, he wanted them publicly weakened, struggling to survive in a city that no longer tolerated their noise. Lina noticed Marco's absence more and more. He came home late, often after she was asleep, his clothes smelling faintly of cigar smoke and night air. She didn't ask questions because she already knew the answers. Every time she saw him sitting quietly by the window, lost in thought, she felt a growing distance. He wasn't angry anymore, he was focused, almost too calm. The look in his eyes was the same one he had when closing a deal, patient, deliberate, and unstoppable. Lina worried that his sense of justice might turn into something darker. Angelo stopped by again, hoping to talk sense into Marco. He warned that pushing too far could attract police attention, or worse. Marco listened but didn't respond. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handed one to his brother, and stared at the city below. Angelo could see the answer in his silence. There was no going back. He finished his drink, set it down, and left without another word. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Marco remained by the window, watching lights flicker across the skyline. Every decision was already in motion. 2 days later, Marco's men traced the bikers' side business. They had been running small shipments through the docks, using fake permits. Marco's shipping company conveniently flagged those permits for review. Overnight, the entire operation froze. Cargo vanished, trucks were locked, and access cards stopped working. Vince called around for help but got only excuses. His partners were suddenly unavailable, their numbers disconnected. He didn't know those men worked for Marco, following orders to isolate him completely. The gang's steady income was gone, replaced by debt and confusion. Marco never needed to lift a hand himself. The bikers started turning on each other. Accusations flew over who messed up the paperwork, who leaked information, who caused the trouble. One member left town, claiming he was done. Another was caught stealing from their own stash. Vince tried to hold them together, but every attempt failed. His temper became unpredictable, scaring even the closest members. Marco received updates from Carlo every night, quietly reviewing each new problem like a surgeon studying scans. Every crisis unfolded just as he wanted, controlled, clean, irreversible. The steel serpents were falling apart from within. Lina visited her mother in the countryside to clear her mind. Away from the city, she felt lighter. She didn't tell her mother what had happened, only that she needed a few days of rest. They spent mornings cooking and evenings watching the sunset. For the first time since that night, Lina smiled genuinely. She didn't know Marco had already begun closing in on the bikers' remaining connections. Her absence gave him space to finish what he started. He believed he was protecting her honor, not realizing she had already made peace with the past. Marco sat in his office surrounded by paperwork, maps, and reports. His lawyer briefed him on progress. 3 of the bikers had lost their jobs due to background checks he orchestrated. One had his car repossessed after a sudden bank review. Marco approved every action with a nod. His men thought he was satisfied, but Marco felt only emptiness. Lina's calm silence haunted him. He couldn't erase the image of her walking out of that diner, proud and hurt. He told himself this was justice, but something inside him whispered it was revenge wearing a suit. Vince woke up to pounding on his door. 2 officers stood outside asking questions about a stolen bike linked to his name. He denied everything, but his frustration showed. After they left, he smashed a glass against the wall. He couldn't prove it, but he felt someone was pulling strings against him. The calls to his suppliers went unanswered again. One message from a friend warned him to lay low. Vince laughed bitterly. He didn't realize the ground beneath him was gone, stripped piece by piece until only his pride remained. That pride wouldn't save him now. Lina returned home after several days, bringing warmth back into the mansion. She cooked dinner, filled the house with light, and tried to bring Marco out of his silence. He joined her at the table but said little. She noticed the faint smirk when he glanced at the news headlines about biker arrests. She knew then what he had done, though she didn't confront him. Instead, she told him softly that peace couldn't be built from someone else's ruin. Marco didn't respond. He only reached for her hand, still convinced that what he'd done was necessary. At the docks, another member of the Steel Serpents was cornered by a group of men in dark coats. No one touched him, they just spoke calmly, reminding him of unpaid debts and expired deals. He left town that night without collecting his belongings. Marco's influence spread quietly through the city's undercurrent. Every door the gang knocked on stayed closed. Every favor they tried to call in went unanswered. The city had turned its back on them, not out of fear, but out of respect for who had spoken in silence. Marco's justice was nearly complete. News began to circulate about the Steel Serpents breaking apart. Local authorities credited internal conflict, but those who understood the city knew better. Marco never showed up in those reports, never appeared in meetings or investigations. His name wasn't needed, his reputation spoke louder. The gang scattered in different directions, leaving behind debts, broken bikes, and ruined pride. Lina saw the news on television one morning while making coffee. She turned the volume down, wondering how much destruction one act of humiliation had set in motion. Nothing about it felt victorious anymore. Marco met with Angelo once more, this time at their father's old warehouse. The younger brother looked around, shaking his head at how much their world had changed. He reminded Marco that the empire their family built was supposed to protect, not destroy. Marco listened quietly but didn't argue. He believed what he did was protection. Angelo left him with a final thought, that sometimes strength means letting go. Marco stood alone afterward, staring at the empty building. He realized he hadn't spoken to Lina properly in days. He missed her calm voice more than he admitted. That evening, Marco arrived home earlier than usual. He found Lina sitting on the balcony, watching the skyline. She didn't turn when he stepped outside. He sat beside her in silence. For the first time in weeks, the air between them felt still but not heavy. She asked if everything was over, and he said yes. They sat quietly, both knowing the answer carried more weight than it seemed. The city below glowed, unaware of the balance restored. Marco had won, but something in his victory felt hollow, like peace built on fragile ground. Marco spent the next morning in his office, sorting through paperwork while pretending to focus on business. His assistant entered quietly, setting down a newspaper with another headline about the Steel Serpents disbanding. Marco didn't react. He flipped the paper closed and told the assistant to cancel his meetings. When the door shut again, he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The silence in his office felt strange now. Everything was resolved, but the satisfaction he expected never came. Justice had been served, yet it tasted bitter. He wondered when revenge had started feeling so heavy. Lina found Marco sitting alone later that afternoon. She brought him coffee and sat across from him without speaking. He looked at her hand resting on the table, the same hand that had trembled when she walked out of that diner. It no longer shook. She seemed calm, even stronger somehow. He admired her quiet strength but also felt guilty for what he'd done behind her back. She thanked him for protecting her, but said peace mattered more than pride. Her words lingered long after she left the room, settling into his thoughts like a quiet echo. At the diner, new workers scrubbed the floors and removed the broken chairs. A small sign on the door announced new management. The old owner had sold the place overnight, the paperwork handled by a company name no one recognized. The neighbors noticed unfamiliar cars parked outside for days, but no one asked questions. By the time the doors reopened, everything inside looked different. New paint, new staff, new energy. The memory of what happened to Lina faded from public talk, but those who witnessed it remembered the look on her face as she walked away. Marco decided to visit the diner himself one night. The streets were quiet when his car stopped at the curb. He stepped inside the empty space, now cleaned and redecorated. The smell of fresh paint filled the air. He walked to the same spot where Lina had stood that night, his shoes echoing faintly against the floor. He placed a folded napkin on the counter and stood there for a moment, eyes fixed on it. It wasn't a threat or a gesture of anger. It was closure, silent and final, meant for no one but himself. Vince sat in a rundown motel room miles from the city, scrolling through his phone in frustration. Every contact he called ignored him. His money was nearly gone, and the few men still loyal to him were already talking about leaving town. He didn't understand how everything had fallen apart so fast. One wrong night, one simple act, and his world had collapsed. He slammed the phone down and stared at the cracked wall. Pride kept him from running, but fear was creeping in. Somewhere deep down, he knew this wasn't bad luck. It was design. Back home, Lina sat by the window with a book she wasn't really reading. She could sense Marco's unease even without looking at him. He moved through the house quietly, speaking little as though waiting for something else to happen. She wished he could let it go, but she also understood him. His whole life had been about control, and letting things slide went against everything he believed. When he finally sat beside her, neither spoke. Their silence wasn't cold anymore. It was the sound of two people realizing peace sometimes costs more than war. The following week, Marco met with one of his construction managers at a downtown site. Workers nodded respectfully as he passed, knowing his reputation, as they discussed contracts. A group of reporters nearby mentioned the viral diner story again. Marco heard them but didn't react. He realized the city had already moved on. The world had forgotten the waitress and the bikers. But for him, the story was carved into something personal. As he walked away from the noise of the site, he promised himself this would be the last time he ever let anger guide him. Angelo visited Lina that weekend while Marco was out. He brought flowers and coffee, claiming it was just a friendly visit. They talked about family, childhood, and how Marco used to be before business hardened him. Lina admitted she worried about the darkness in him, even if it came from love. Angelo assured her that Marco's heart was still good, only buried under layers of duty. Before leaving, he told her something she hadn't realized, that Marco had spent years protecting her name quietly long before this incident ever happened. She smiled faintly, unsure whether to feel comforted or sad. Marco received a message that night saying Vince had been spotted near one of his warehouses. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at the message for a long time, thinking of Lina asleep upstairs. Finally, he typed a short reply. "Leave him." The words felt strange under his fingers. This time he wanted no confrontation. He was done. The men followed orders, and Vince, unaware of how close he'd come to another downfall, left the city by dawn. For the first time in weeks, Marco felt lighter, though the guilt didn't fade completely. Days passed quietly. The mansion's halls no longer echoed with tension. Marco spent mornings reading the newspaper, afternoons at work, and evenings with Lina in the garden. They spoke of normal things: meals, travel, family. Still, whenever she laughed, a faint shadow crossed his face. He couldn't forget that his world of control had touched hers. She had carried herself with grace, and he had answered it with silent fury. Now he wondered if he had done more harm than good. For a man who once ruled through power, the idea of regret was unfamiliar and unwelcome. At a small cafe downtown, two of Marco's men discussed the aftermath. They noted how easily the steel serpents vanished, how every trace of them had been erased from the city's underworld. One joked that even their graffiti was painted over. The other only nodded, saying the boss had done it right this time. No blood, no noise, just quiet disappearance. What they didn't say out loud was that the power Marco held scared even them. If he could erase an entire gang without lifting a hand, what else could he erase? Some debts were better left unspoken. Lina returned to the diner, weeks later. It looked brighter now, filled with new faces. She chose a seat in the corner near the window. The waitress recognized her but said nothing, only offering a kind smile. Lina ordered coffee and sat in silence, watching customers chat and laugh like nothing had ever happened here. She traced her fingers across the clean tabletop, remembering the night her world changed. For the first time, the memory didn't sting. It felt distant, like a storm she had already outlasted. Leaving the diner, she carried no bitterness with her. That evening, Marco joined her on the balcony as she watered the plants. She told him she'd gone to the diner. His expression tightened, but she reassured him that everything was fine. She said the place had changed, and maybe that was enough. He nodded, though his eyes showed doubt. For Marco, change didn't erase what had happened, it only covered it. Lina placed a hand on his arm and said softly that life wasn't about erasing pain, but learning to grow around it. He didn't answer, but her words settled somewhere deep inside him. In the weeks that followed, the story of the waitress faded completely from public memory. New scandals replaced it online, and no one mentioned the steel serpents again. For Marco, that silence was a victory. For Lina, it was freedom. She started painting again, something she hadn't done in years. Her art was simple: flowers, windows, streets, but each one carried peace. Marco often watched her work, silently admiring how she could rebuild what life tried to break. He wished he could find that same peace within himself, but his world didn't allow for such softness. Angelo began noticing small changes in his brother. Marco stopped attending certain business meetings, handing responsibility to others. He declined calls from men who once relied on him for power. Angelo saw it as progress, though he knew Marco's withdrawal came from exhaustion more than reform. Still, it was something. The empire ran smoothly without him, proving he didn't need to control everything anymore. Marco didn't say it out loud, but he had started believing that true strength wasn't in dominance, it was in restraint. He was learning that lesson the hard way, one quiet day at a time. Lina's life found rhythm again. She woke early, cooked breakfast, and sat with Marco before he left for work. She went for walks through the nearby park, enjoying the calm she had once taken for granted. Neighbors greeted her kindly, unaware of who she truly was or what her husband had done. She preferred it that way. For her, power meant nothing if it couldn't bring peace. She had seen enough pride destroy people to know that letting go was sometimes the only real victory. The world around her finally matched the calm she'd been craving. One afternoon, Lina visited a small community shelter downtown. The director recognized her from somewhere but couldn't place it. She offered to help with volunteer work, saying she had free time. Within days, she became part of their team, quietly assisting with food drives and outreach programs. The people there didn't know her story, and she didn't tell it. Working among strangers who treated her like anyone else gave her a kind of healing she hadn't expected. Every smile she saw made her believe that kindness, not control, was what truly rebuilt broken worlds. Marco's driver noticed the change too. The man who once demanded silence now asked about small things: family, football, weather. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, he was simply tired of commanding. His voice had softened. Some nights, he stayed in the car longer than needed after returning home, sitting quietly in the driveway before stepping inside. It wasn't guilt anymore, it was reflection. He had power, money, and respect, but none of it had given him the peace that Lina found so easily. He began wondering if maybe she was the stronger one after all. Vince resurfaced months later in another city, working small jobs and keeping a low profile. He never spoke about what happened, but those who knew him noticed he was different. The loud, arrogant man had been replaced by someone quiet, wary, and older in spirit. He carried the weight of lessons learned too late. Sometimes he caught his reflection and remembered the woman he humiliated, wondering how her life turned out. In some twisted way, he admired her for walking away with dignity while he lost everything chasing pride. Regret was his only companion now. Lina painted a piece titled "Still Standing." It showed a single figure walking away from a bright doorway, shadow stretching long behind her. When she finished, she placed it near the fireplace. Marco saw it that night and understood exactly what it meant. She had survived humiliation, and instead of letting it define her, she turned it into strength. He realized that while he fought for revenge, she had already won through grace. The painting reminded him of what true resilience looked like: quiet, steady, unshakable. He wished he had learned that sooner. The house staff noticed how much softer the atmosphere had become. Marco and Lina started hosting small dinners again, something they hadn't done in years. The laughter that returned to their home felt genuine, this time. Marco rarely discussed business during these evenings. He listened more, spoke less, and found comfort in ordinary moments. Lina's calm presence seemed to anchor him. Guests left talking about how different Marco had become. They didn't know that beneath that calm exterior lived a man who had finally discovered how much peace could cost, and why it was worth every price. Angelo came by again one evening with news that another small gang had been causing trouble downtown. He asked Marco if he wanted to handle it personally. Marco shook his head and said he was done with that life. Angelo laughed, thinking he was joking, but Marco meant it. The younger brother left feeling oddly proud. As Marco poured himself a glass of water, he realized something simple: power had once been his addiction, but now peace was. He had spent years chasing control, only to learn the hardest truth: control was never the same as peace. Lina's volunteering work grew into something more serious. She began managing donation drives and organizing medical aid events. People in the community started recognizing her as a quiet force of change. She didn't crave credit or attention, she simply wanted to give back. The same grace that once made her walk away from cruelty now fueled her to build something good. When Marco attended one of her events unannounced, he stood at the back of the crowd, unseen, watching her lead with kindness. For the first time in years, he felt genuine admiration instead of pride. One morning, Lina found Marco sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through an old photo album. It showed pictures from their early days, before the business and before the power. She sat beside him, and they laughed softly at how young they looked. He admitted he missed that simplicity. She told him it was still possible if he wanted it to be. That quiet conversation changed him more than any lesson ever could. He realized peace wasn't something to chase. It was something to choose, one decision at a time, and he chose it, finally. By the end of that year, the city had all but forgotten the name Steel Serpents. The diner was thriving again, and Lina's art had been displayed in a small local gallery. Marco rarely left her side anymore, content to live quietly. Their home, once filled with unspoken tension, now carried laughter and warmth. They didn't talk about the past because they didn't need to. It lived inside them as a quiet reminder of how far they'd come. For Marco, revenge had ended that night at the diner. For Lina, strength had only just begun. The following spring brought a softer rhythm to their lives. The garden bloomed again, and Lina filled the house with color and music. Marco spent his mornings walking along the property line, greeting workers, asking about their families. He was quieter now, but his silence carried peace instead of anger. The city had changed too. People who once feared the DeLuca name now respected it for different reasons. Lina's influence reached further than either of them realized, turning their home into something that inspired calm rather than command. For once, they both felt free. Angelo noticed the shift the first time he visited after months away. The guards were relaxed, the staff smiled easily, and even Marco's tone had softened. Over dinner, Angelo teased his brother about turning into a saint. Marco just smiled and said some lessons take time. Lina listened quietly, watching the two brothers laugh again like they used to. It felt like a piece of their old lives had returned, untouched by power or revenge. When Angelo left that night, he told Lina privately that her calm had changed Marco more than anything else ever could. At the same time, the diner's new owners began thriving. They hired more staff, offered fair wages, and built a small reputation for treating everyone equally. Customers returned, filling the seats that once held trouble. On the wall, they placed a framed picture of Lina with a small caption that read, "For Courage." People often asked about it, but no one ever got the full story. The picture became more of a symbol than a memory. It reminded every worker there that quiet strength could still make the loudest difference in the world. One evening, Marco returned home to find Lina painting by the fireplace. He watched her for a long time before sitting beside her. The brush moved slowly in her hand, colors blending into soft patterns. She asked what he saw when he looked at the painting. He said peace, and she smiled. That word used to sound foreign in their house, but now it fit perfectly. For Marco, it wasn't the mansion or money that made him feel safe anymore. It was the quiet hum of her life moving forward, untouched by hate or fear. Outside their mansion gates, the city carried on as usual. No one remembered the night at the diner, the video, or the gang that had once roamed freely. The world had moved on, leaving behind only those who lived the story. For Marco and Lina, that was enough. They didn't need anyone else to understand. Their life had become smaller, but in the best way, measured in moments, not victories. The weight that once filled Marco's chest was gone. He could finally breathe without thinking about control. For him, that felt like the greatest revenge of all. Months later, an invitation arrived for a charity gala downtown. The event was in Lina's name, honoring her work at the shelter. She hesitated to attend, uncomfortable with recognition, but Marco encouraged her. The night of the event, she wore a simple black dress and greeted people humbly. Guests whispered about how kind she was, unaware of her full story. Marco stood at the back, proud but quiet, letting her take the attention. When she spoke about forgiveness and grace, the room went still. No one knew her words came from the deepest scars of her own past. After the gala, Marco and Lina walked along the waterfront together. The city lights reflected across the calm river. He told her she had changed how people saw them, turning their name into something clean again. She smiled, saying it wasn't her, it was both of them choosing differently. He thought about that for a while. Maybe change wasn't about one grand decision, but 1,000 small ones done quietly. That night, he decided to shut down the last of his shadow businesses. He didn't tell anyone. Some things didn't need to be announced to be real. Marco began spending more time at home. His men handled the outside world, but his focus shifted to rebuilding the life he almost lost. He started learning to cook, surprising Lina with breakfast one morning. The meal wasn't perfect, but the effort mattered more. Lina laughed, calling it his best business deal yet. He realized she was right. Their life no longer revolved around power but presence. He found joy in ordinary things, something he never thought possible. For the first time since his youth, Marco DeLuca felt like just a man, not a name to be feared. Meanwhile, one of Marco's former associates approached him with an offer to expand back into old territories. It was a tempting deal, promising money and influence. Marco listened politely but declined. The man pressed, reminding him who he used to be. Marco simply said he was done building empires that stole peace from others. When the associate left, he laughed bitterly, convinced Marco had gone soft. But Marco didn't mind. Power had never made him sleep well. Now he could rest easily beside his wife without wondering whose downfall would come next. That was enough for him. Lina's art gained quiet attention from local galleries. Her work wasn't grand, but it felt honest. Critics called it calming, though none of them knew the pain behind the brushstrokes. She used no titles, only dates. Marco attended her first exhibit in secret, standing behind the crowd as they admired her paintings. When someone asked about the inspiration behind her art, she smiled and said it came from learning how to breathe again. Marco stayed quiet, feeling proud but humbled. He finally understood what healing looked like when it wasn't wrapped in pride or noise. A journalist eventually discovered Lina's connection to the viral diner story and requested an interview. She refused at first, but Marco encouraged her to tell her version, calmly, truthfully, and without hate. The interview aired weeks later. It wasn't sensational or dramatic. Lina spoke about dignity, patience, and why walking away didn't mean weakness. The story went viral again, but this time for the right reasons. Thousands commented about her grace, while no one mentioned revenge or her husband's power. For once their names stood for something clean. The cycle had quietly turned toward redemption. Marco watched the interview alone in his study. Seeing Lina speak so calmly about forgiveness stirred something inside him. He realized how far she had come compared to how much he still carried. He had won his battles, but she had conquered hers. When she came home that night, he met her at the door, said nothing, and simply held her. In that moment he understood that forgiveness didn't erase the past, it just stopped it from owning the future. That lesson, learned through her strength, was one he would carry for the rest of his life. The man who once lived by power and fear began mentoring younger business owners, teaching them how to lead without cruelty. He didn't use grand speeches or advice about dominance. Instead, he talked about responsibility, respect, and self-control. His words surprised those who remembered his reputation. When they asked what changed him, he only smiled and said life had a way of reminding you what truly matters. It wasn't about power anymore, it was about people. For the first time, his influence wasn't built on fear, but on the quiet weight of experience. The city's whispers about the DeLuca family faded over time. People no longer spoke about power or money when they mentioned their name. They spoke about generosity and quiet respect. Lina's volunteer work continued to grow, while Marco's mentorship programs helped dozens of small businesses. The balance between them became clear. Her compassion and his discipline created something lasting. What began as a story of humiliation had turned into one of healing. Together, they had rewritten the ending that life tried to hand them, proving that change doesn't need noise to make history. One afternoon, Lina and Marco visited the shelter together. The children there adored her, and Marco found himself smiling as they ran to her. A small boy tugged at his sleeve, asking if he was her husband. When Marco said yes, the boy nodded and said she was kind to everyone. The simplicity of that truth hit him deeply. Kindness was her power. He realized that while he'd spent his life building fear, she had built love, and love had proven stronger. It was the first time Marco truly saw what kind of legacy they were leaving behind. Later that evening, they returned home just as rain began to fall. The sound against the windows filled the house with calm. Lina lit a candle and placed it near the window. She said it reminded her of peace after storms. Marco watched her in silence, understanding the meaning without needing an explanation. The woman who once walked out of that diner humiliated, now stood taller than ever. He had tried to protect her dignity, but she had rebuilt it herself. The candlelight reflected on her face, like proof that no cruelty could dim her light. Marco's mind wandered that night to the life they could have had if pride hadn't ruled him for so long. He imagined years spent in peace instead of dominance. But he also knew those choices shaped who he was now. Regret was a strange thing. It hurt but also healed. As he lay beside Lina, he felt gratitude more than sorrow. They had both changed, both suffered, both survived. The scars didn't define them anymore. They guided them, and in that quiet, he made a silent promise to never let darkness touch their lives again. The next morning, Marco visited the gravesite of his father. He hadn't been there in years. The headstone was clean, but the flowers had long faded. He placed fresh ones down and stood quietly. He told his father in his mind that he'd finally learned what strength really meant. It wasn't about control, money, or fear. It was about peace. He left the cemetery feeling lighter than he had in decades. When he returned home, Lina met him at the door and saw the difference instantly. She didn't ask what happened. She just smiled and welcomed him in. That weekend, Lina hosted a dinner at the shelter to celebrate their volunteers. Marco joined her, helping serve meals instead of sitting at the head table. The volunteers were surprised to see him there, not giving orders but carrying trays. He blended in like anyone else, smiling and joking quietly with the staff. Watching him, Lina realized he wasn't pretending. This was real. The man who once ruled with authority was now content to serve others. It wasn't weakness, it was growth. For the first time, Marco DeLuca was exactly where he was meant to be. On their way home that night, the city lights stretched endlessly ahead of them. Marco rolled down the car window, letting the wind brush against his face. Lina rested her head on his shoulder. They didn't need to speak. Their silence was full of understanding. The world they had built now belonged to peace, not fear. As they passed the diner's street, Marco glanced at it briefly. The sign glowed softly, full of life again. He smiled faintly. That place no longer haunted them. It had become the proof that grace always wins over pride. A few days later, Marco received an unexpected letter from a small-town mayor. It thanked him and Lina for their quiet contributions to community programs. He read it twice, realizing how different this kind of recognition felt. It wasn't about headlines or respect born from fear. It was about gratitude. He showed the letter to Lina, who laughed softly and said, "You see, people remember kindness too." He framed the letter and hung it in his office right above where the torn Waitress uniform had once rested. The replacement felt symbolic, like balance finally restored. That evening, Lina painted again while Marco read nearby. Her new piece was brighter than the others, filled with warm colors and light. She said she didn't know what to name it yet. He looked at it for a while before suggesting the word home. She smiled, agreeing quietly. The word carried more meaning than either of them said aloud. It wasn't just a place. It was a feeling, one they'd built together through pain, patience, and forgiveness. The canvas dried overnight, but the peace it represented stayed with them long after. Months passed in quiet harmony. Marco's health improved, his stress lowered, and his circle grew smaller but truer. He found contentment in the ordinary. A morning walk, Lina's laughter, the scent of food cooking in the kitchen. Their life had become slower, grounded, almost simple. Friends who visited remarked how much they seemed like different people. Lina always said they hadn't changed. They had just remembered who they were before the world hardened them. It was true. Beneath all the layers of power and pain, they had always been two people searching for peace. One afternoon, a delivery arrived at the mansion, an old photograph framed in black wood. It was of Lina at the diner, taken by someone who had captured that night's chaos. No note came with it. Marco held it for a moment, then placed it in a drawer instead of destroying it. He decided it should stay, not as shame, but as reminder. That single moment had nearly broken them, yet it became the start of everything better. Sometimes the worst nights lead to the best lessons. For Marco, that picture represented the cost of becoming human again. Lina found Marco sitting by the fireplace that night, staring at nothing. She sat beside him, their hands meeting without a word. He told her quietly that he had kept the photograph. She nodded, understanding why. It wasn't about reliving pain. It was about honoring the road they'd walked together. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence with warmth. They sat there until the flames dimmed, content just to exist, side by side. Neither of them needed to speak anymore. Their peace had become its own language, one they had fought hard to earn. Time passed, and the world outside moved faster than Marco and Lina's quiet life. New businesses rose, new names gained power, and the DeLuca name slipped from gossip into memory. People still respected Marco, but in a different way now. He was the man who helped others, not the man who ruled over them. Lina's projects kept growing, drawing attention from charities and even local officials. Together they became symbols of redemption, without ever trying to be. Their story had changed shape from fear and control to calm and purpose, lived quietly behind those iron gates. One morning, Lina received a letter from a young woman who worked at the diner. She wrote about how much the staff respected her story and how the restaurant's culture had transformed. The letter thanked her for showing strength without anger, for proving that dignity could change an entire place. Lina smiled reading it. Marco found her at the kitchen table, eyes soft. She handed him the letter, and he read it in silence. It wasn't fame or revenge that moved them anymore. It was knowing they'd made something better out of something cruel. Marco began funding scholarships for hospitality workers, naming the program after his late mother. He said it was a way to honor women like Lina, those who built strength quietly while the world looked elsewhere. When the first group of students graduated, Lina attended the ceremony and cried softly during their speeches. Many didn't know who she was, but she didn't need them to. The pride in their faces was enough. Every time she saw them step into new lives, it reminded her how one act of humiliation had turned into countless acts of kindness instead. At home, Marco's study no longer held reminders of power. The desk once cluttered with files and contracts was now lined with photos, drawings, and small gifts from people he had helped. The walls felt lighter, the air calmer. Lina often brought him tea while he worked, and they'd talk about small things, the garden, the weather, what to cook for dinner. It wasn't grand or exciting, but it was real. Every ordinary moment felt precious after everything they'd survived. The empire he once built through control was replaced by something far more valuable: peace of mind. Angelo visited again and found his brother sitting on the porch reading a book. He laughed, saying he never thought he'd see Marco relax like that. Marco replied that life had a way of teaching lessons. You can't avoid forever. They talked about their father and how different things might have been if he'd learned peace earlier too. Angelo admitted he envied Marco's calm. It wasn't weakness anymore, it was wisdom. As he left that evening, Angelo finally believed his brother's transformation wasn't temporary. It was real, built from scars instead of pride. Lina's art show expanded to a larger gallery in the city. This time Marco attended openly, standing beside her as people admired her work. A reporter asked if her paintings were inspired by pain or recovery. She said both, because one led to the other. Her answer resonated with everyone who heard it. After the event, Marco walked her to the car and told her she had healed the city more than she knew. She smiled, saying she only wanted to paint the truth, and in her quiet way, that's exactly what she had done. Marco spent more time mentoring young leaders who grew up in rough neighborhoods. He told them how easy it was to lose yourself when power becomes your only goal. They listened because they saw truth in his eyes. He didn't hide his past or his mistakes. He told them peace wasn't weakness. It was the hardest discipline to master. Each session left him humbled. Every story of struggle reminded him where he'd come from and how close he once came to losing everything that mattered. It wasn't about saving others, it was about staying saved himself. Late one night, Marco sat awake while Lina slept beside him. He thought about the night she left the diner and how everything since had unfolded from that single moment. That tear in her shirt had ripped open his entire world, exposing every flaw in the man he thought he was. But maybe that was necessary. Sometimes life breaks you in places that need to heal differently. He reached for her hand under the blanket, holding it gently. It wasn't a gesture of apology anymore, it was gratitude for her strength, her grace, and her forgiveness. Lina dreamed often of that night too, though the memory had softened. In her dreams the lights were dimmer, the laughter quieter, and she always walked out calmer than she remembered. When she woke, she never felt anger, only clarity. That night had changed both of them, reshaping how they saw the world. It wasn't about what was taken from her anymore, but what she gained after: dignity, courage, and the kind of peace that couldn't be destroyed by cruelty. She didn't hate the past. It had simply taught her who she truly was. Marco's reputation reached new corners of the city. Politicians invited him to panels about leadership, but he declined them all. He didn't want to stand on stages or give speeches. He'd done enough talking in his old life. Now he preferred action, quiet, consistent, unseen. The city no longer feared the DeLuca name, and Marco wanted to keep it that way. He knew how fragile peace could be. One wrong move, one bad decision, and everything could crumble again. That awareness made him careful with every step, grateful for every calm day he got to live. Lina was asked to speak at a women's conference about resilience. She almost said no, afraid of attention, but Marco convinced her otherwise. On stage, she shared her story simply, without drama. She spoke about how dignity wasn't about pride, but about holding your ground when others try to take it from you. Her words drew quiet tears from the audience. She didn't mention Marco or revenge or power, only forgiveness and growth. When she stepped off stage, people lined up to thank her. For many, her calm honesty hit harder than any dramatic speech could. After the conference, Marco took her out for dinner at a quiet rooftop restaurant. As they watched the city from above, he told her he was proud. She laughed, saying pride was dangerous, and he smiled at the reminder. They talked about how far they had come, from anger and control to peace and gratitude. The city looked beautiful from where they sat, lights stretching endlessly. Marco realized that this view, peaceful and quiet, was worth more than any power he ever held. It was the one thing money could never buy, a life that finally felt earned. At the shelter, Lina noticed a new volunteer, a young single mother who reminded her of herself years ago. The woman was shy, nervous, and unsure of her worth. Lina guided her gently, helping her build confidence. Over months, that woman blossomed into one of their best workers. Watching her grow made Lina realize how cycles could change when kindness replaced judgment. She saw herself not as a survivor anymore but as a guide. It wasn't about forgetting pain but transforming it into something that helped others find their own strength. That, she believed, was true healing. Marco's health began improving as he spent more time outdoors. He took long walks with Lina through the gardens, enjoying the simple act of being alive. Every flower, every quiet breeze felt meaningful. The man who once controlled half the city now measured his happiness in small moments. He wasn't proud of everything he'd done, but he was grateful for where it led him. The power that once defined him had faded into something softer. The respect he now received wasn't built on fear, but on understanding. For Marco, that was all the legacy he needed. One day, Lina found Marco reading an old notebook filled with business notes and plans for expansion. He closed it and said he didn't recognize the man who wrote it. She told him that version of him had to exist, so this one could. They laughed quietly, but her words stayed with him. Sometimes the hardest part of change was forgiving who you used to be. He decided to keep the notebook as a reminder of growth. It wasn't shame, it was proof that transformation was possible even for those who thought they'd never change. A journalist later published a story about Marco's transformation, calling him the Quiet King. The article focused on how his empire had shifted from control to compassion. Marco didn't comment, but Lina read it aloud, smiling at how far they had come. The world loved redemption stories, but theirs was different. It wasn't built on grand gestures, it was built on silence, patience, and a choice to walk away when pride demanded otherwise. The journalist ended the piece saying Marco had become proof that even power could be redefined. Marco thought the title was poetic, but unnecessary. The mansion became a home for everyone who entered it. Staff felt comfortable, friends visited often, and laughter replaced tension. Lina started hosting art workshops for children in one of the spare rooms. Marco watched from the doorway as the kids painted freely, filling the space with joy. He thought back to all the years he'd filled these halls with authority instead of warmth. Now the sound of children's laughter felt like music. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a fortress, it felt like a home, filled with the kind of peace they'd always needed. Angelo visited with his wife and children one Sunday. They spent the afternoon in the garden sharing food and stories. The kids ran through the grass while Marco and Angelo watched them with smiles. Lina brought lemonade, and for a brief moment everything felt timeless. Angelo told Marco he was proud of the man he'd become. Marco thanked him quietly. That simple day meant more to him than any deal or victory ever had. Family, laughter, and peace. That was the real empire he had built now, and he would protect it differently this time. One evening, a letter arrived from Vince. It was short, handwritten, and sincere. He said he had built an honest life and wanted to thank Marco and Lina for teaching him humility, even if it came through pain. Marco showed it to Lina, unsure what to feel. She read it, smiled faintly, and said forgiveness sometimes travels farther than we think. They decided not to reply, knowing the silence was enough. It meant the story had finally reached its end, not with revenge, but with understanding from both sides. Some closures don't need words to be complete. Lina added Vince's letter to a small wooden box where she kept reminders of her journey, photos, newspaper clippings, and thank you notes. She didn't keep them to relive pain, but to remember growth. That box for her wasn't filled with memories of hate. It was proof that change was real. Marco once asked why she didn't throw it all away. She told him peace didn't come from forgetting, but from remembering without hurting. He never asked again. He knew she was right. Forgetting the past meant risking its return, but remembering it brought wisdom. Their nights grew quieter as years passed. They spent them talking less and appreciating more. The warmth of the fire, the comfort of routine, the small moments that made life whole. Sometimes Lina would hum softly as Marco closed his eyes beside her. The tune carried peace he'd never found anywhere else. It reminded him that some lessons in life take pain to teach, but they're worth every scar. He had spent years chasing control, but in the end he found peace only by letting it go. That realization stayed with him until his last breath. When Marco fell ill briefly one winter, Lina stayed by his side, refusing to leave. The doctor said it was exhaustion, nothing serious, but she saw it differently. She saw it as a reminder that time was precious. As he recovered, they talked more about the future, what they wanted to leave behind, what mattered most. He told her he didn't want monuments or legacies, he just wanted people to remember kindness when they heard their names. She promised to make that happen, not through speeches, but through actions, exactly the way they had lived their story. Spring returned, and with it came another letter, this time from the shelter. It invited Lina and Marco to attend a new opening named in their honor. The building had been funded quietly through Marco's donations, but the community insisted on recognizing them. They agreed to attend, humbled by the gesture. When they arrived, children ran to greet them, and volunteers clapped. Marco stood there quietly, letting Lina take the spotlight. As she spoke to the crowd, he looked at her and realized their story had come full circle, from humiliation to honor, from chaos to calm. After the ceremony, they walked through the shelter halls together. The walls were painted with bright murals, some inspired by Lina's art. One small section near the entrance displayed a plaque that read, "Strength isn't loud, it's steady." Marco stopped to read it, feeling the truth in every word. He realized that this quiet influence was their real legacy. It wasn't about dominance or power, it was about how they had rebuilt themselves and the world around them with patience and grace. It was the kind of ending that didn't need applause to be complete. That night, as they returned home, the mansion lights glowed softly through the trees. They walked inside, hand in hand, moving through familiar halls that no longer felt heavy. The ghosts of the past had long left. They sat by the fireplace, not speaking, just feeling the calm they'd created. The sound of the wind outside felt peaceful, not lonely. Marco looked at Lina, realizing everything he once fought for had led to this moment, a life built not on fear, but on love. Their story, once born from pain, had become a quiet lesson in redemption. Months later, the diner reached its 5th anniversary under new ownership. A quiet ceremony was held, and someone mentioned Lina's name with gratitude. She didn't attend, but she heard about it through friends. Knowing the place where her pain began had become a symbol of respect felt enough. Life had moved on, but the lessons stayed alive. Marco smiled when she told him, saying the world had finally caught up with her grace. For Lina, that was closure, the kind that didn't need revenge or words, only the quiet satisfaction of seeing kindness win in the end. The following week, Lina hosted another charity dinner at their home. Volunteers, friends, and families filled the rooms that once echoed with silence. Laughter carried through the hallways, as children ran around with plates of food. Marco stood by the door, watching them with quiet pride. He realized this house had transformed from a fortress of control into a place of warmth. The life he once guarded so fiercely now thrived freely, built on trust and peace. As the evening ended, Lina caught his eye from across the room, and that single look said everything. Late that night, after everyone left, Marco and Lina walked through the garden. The moonlight stretched across the stone path, and the scent of flowers filled the air. Marco told her he sometimes thought about how different things could have been if she had never walked into that diner. She smiled and said she wouldn't change a thing. Pain had taught them both who they truly were. He realized she was right. Without that night, they might never have learned the value of peace, or how far love could go when it refused to turn bitter. Years continued to pass gently. The city changed, people moved, and the world found new stories to tell. Yet their lives stayed grounded in simplicity. Marco stepped away from all business, choosing a quieter retirement. Lina continued her art and volunteer work, teaching young people how to heal through creativity. Together they built a rhythm that no storm could disturb. Sometimes they spoke about the past, not with regret but with gratitude. Every scar they carried had shaped the peace they now lived in, and that realization made even their quietest moments feel complete. One morning, Lina found Marco sitting by the window, lost in thought. He looked older but content. When she asked what he was thinking about, he said he was proud of how they turned hurt into purpose. She took his hand and said, "That's what real strength was, the ability to create light after darkness." They shared a long silence, just holding hands and watching the sunrise. It painted their faces with soft gold, like the world itself was offering them peace. For Marco, it was the first morning he didn't feel the weight of yesterday. The shelter expanded that year, opening branches in 2 new districts. Lina's influence became known across the city. Though she never sought attention, people called her the calm that built hope. Marco quietly funded most of the projects, always staying behind the scenes. Every time a new building opened, he felt something settle inside him, a peace he had chased his entire life. The same hands that once built empires, now built homes for those who needed them most. It wasn't redemption through words, it was redemption through deeds, and that mattered far more. Their home became a gathering place for those they had helped. Old staff, young families, and volunteers often visited, filling the space with energy. Lina cooked for them, while Marco shared quiet stories about life and patience. He never spoke of power or his past, only about balance. People left inspired, not by his wealth, but by his humility. The man who once demanded respect now earned it through kindness. Even the children who visited knew him not as a boss, but as someone who understood what it meant to start over. That became his legacy. As time went on, Marco began writing short reflections in a notebook. They weren't business notes, but thoughts about life. Lessons learned from mistakes. He never intended to publish them, yet those pages carried the heart of a man who had changed completely. Lina often found him in the library, smiling softly as he wrote. She asked what he'd do with it one day, and he said it wasn't for anyone else. It was for her to read when he no longer could tell her stories himself. The honesty in that promise touched her deeply. Lina read parts of that notebook one night after he fell asleep. His words were simple, written in his unsteady handwriting. He wrote about dignity, love, and how silence could be stronger than revenge. He admitted his greatest lesson was learning that power without compassion destroyed everything. By the time she reached the last page, her eyes were wet. She closed the notebook gently and placed it back where he left it. That small book, more than any fortune or empire, was proof that transformation could live quietly inside a single human heart. As years went by, Marco's health started to decline slowly. He moved with less energy, his steps slower, his voice softer. Lina stayed beside him every day, refusing to let him feel like a burden. They spent more time on the porch, watching the world go by. He often said the greatest joy of his life was watching her build everything he couldn't. She reminded him that they built it together. Each day felt borrowed but beautiful. The man who once feared losing control now found peace in simply letting life unfold. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Marco asked Lina to bring his old notebook. She handed it to him, and he smiled weakly. He asked her to read it aloud. Her voice filled the room, steady and warm, carrying the lessons he'd written years before. He closed his eyes, listening. Each word seemed to ease the years between them, blending pain and love into one lasting memory. When she finished, he whispered that everything he ever wanted had already been written there. It was the only legacy he needed to leave behind. Marco passed peacefully that night, his hand resting in Lina's. The room was quiet, lit only by a single lamp. Lina didn't cry at first. She sat beside him, tracing her fingers along his wedding band, remembering every moment that led them here. There was no anger, no regret, only gratitude. He had lived long enough to find peace, and she had loved long enough to witness it. She whispered a quiet goodbye, not as an ending, but as thanks. The rain outside softened to a calm drizzle, like the world itself was offering its farewell. In the weeks after his passing, the city mourned quietly. Newspapers ran short tributes, calling Marco DeLuca a man of transformation. But Lina didn't attend any public events. She spent her days maintaining his garden, tending to the plants he once walked among every morning. The world remembered his success, but she remembered his change. Every flower she watered felt like keeping his memory alive in the way he'd want, quietly, without attention. She didn't need grand gestures. His peace had become part of her own, and that was the most meaningful inheritance of all. Lina decided to publish Marco's notebook, editing nothing. The book was released anonymously, titled Lessons from Silence. It spread slowly, passed from reader to reader, gaining attention for its raw honesty. No one knew the author's name, but its message reached thousands. It spoke about humility, grace, and the power of calm strength. When Lina saw copies being read by strangers in cafes and trains, she smiled softly. Marco's wisdom had found life beyond him, carried not by fame but by truth. That quiet impact was exactly what he would have wanted. Years later, a young man visited Lina at the shelter. He introduced himself as the son of one of the former bikers. He said his father had changed because of the lessons Marco taught him indirectly. He wanted to thank her for forgiving what others couldn't. Lina invited him in for tea. They spoke for hours, and she realized how far the ripple of that one night had spread. Pain had turned into purpose, even for those she never met. Forgiveness had built bridges across generations, proving that compassion could rewrite even the hardest stories. Lina grew older, but her spirit stayed gentle and strong. People often came to her for advice, and she always said the same thing, that peace wasn't found by winning arguments or seeking revenge, but by understanding when to walk away. Her words carried the weight of experience. Some listened, some didn't, but she kept sharing them anyway. She knew every soul had to find their own way to peace. The best she could do was light the path for them, just as she and Marco had lit it for each other long ago. On the 10th anniversary of Marco's passing, Lina visited the diner alone. It looked different. Modern, busy, full of laughter. She sat in her usual corner, ordered coffee, and watched life move around her. No one recognized her now. She liked it that way. She left a generous tip on the table, and a small note that simply read, "Be kind, even when no one's watching." The waitress smiled when she read it, unaware of who had written it. Lina walked out feeling lighter, knowing her story had ended exactly where it began, but this time, in peace. Outside, the city felt familiar but softer. The wind brushed against her hair, carrying scents of coffee and rain. She took a slow breath, feeling time fold gently around her. The ghosts of the past no longer followed her. They walked beside her quietly, part of her story, but no longer her burden. Every sound, every light, every face reminded her of how far she'd come. Her pain had been transformed into wisdom, her scars into stories worth sharing. For Lina, that was all that mattered, that her life had become proof of healing. Back home, Lina placed a candle by Marco's photograph and lit it. She whispered a short prayer, thanking him for the years they shared and for the peace they had both found. She sat for a long time watching the flame flicker, thinking about how love, when lived right, never truly ends. It simply changes shape, moving from presence to memory, from voice to echo. The candle burned low, filling the room with soft light. Lina smiled, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Their story wasn't about endings anymore. It was about what love leaves behind. As seasons passed, the shelter continued to thrive, and her art filled community centers and schools. Young people who knew nothing of her past called her Miss Lina, the kind woman who always listened. She never corrected them or mentioned her history. The past no longer defined her, kindness did. Every smile she saw reminded her of Marco's old words, that peace is the only power worth keeping. She carried that truth quietly, teaching it to others through example rather than advice. The world remembered her not for what she endured, but for how she endured it. In her final years, Lina spent evenings sitting by the same window Marco once loved. The view hadn't changed much. Trees swaying gently, lights flickering in the distance. She often thought about how their story had started with cruelty but ended with compassion. It wasn't the ending most people expected, but it was the one they needed. She had proven that peace could grow even from pain. Her life had become a quiet lesson for anyone who cared to see it, that no matter how broken something begins, it can still end beautifully with grace. When Lina passed, she did so peacefully, surrounded by people whose lives she had touched. Her final words were simple: be gentle with the world. The city mourned quietly, honoring her with small tributes and stories of kindness. No statues, no headlines, just hearts changed by her example. Beside her, the candle she'd lit for Marco had burned down completely, its wax hardened into stillness. Their story had come full circle, a journey from pain to peace, from pride to purpose. Even in death, their lessons continued to ripple quietly through every life they had touched. Years later, a child visiting the shelter asked a volunteer who the people in the old photograph were. The volunteer smiled and said, "They built this place." The child stared at the picture of Marco and Lina, their hands intertwined, and nodded. The names didn't matter, only what they left behind. That shelter, full of light and laughter, stood as living proof of their story. It showed that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers softly through generations, reminding everyone who entered that kindness never truly dies. It only changes hands. The world moved on, but the city still carried traces of their legacy. Murals inspired by Lina's art appeared in small alleys, and her book Lessons from Silence remained on shelves, quietly read by those who needed it most. People found comfort in its simple words, never knowing the full story behind them. Somewhere in those pages, Marco's voice still lived, calm and steady, reminding readers that peace begins within. Through that, their presence lingered, not as ghosts but as gentle reminders that love, forgiveness, and strength outlast everything else. And so the story that began with humiliation ended with harmony. A torn shirt, a cruel laugh, and a single act of restraint had shaped a lifetime of redemption. Lina and Marco's journey proved that true power isn't in control or revenge, it's in the choice to be kind when cruelty would be easier. Their names faded from memory, but their lessons didn't. Somewhere a new waitress stood tall in a crowded diner, treated with respect she didn't have to earn, because two people long ago decided that love would be their legacy.